I guess it's time to get going.
Hey,
For our top news story, I've never heard about drones and weather, but I can't survive really terrible weather, and apparently drones need to learn how to do that. But rapid adaptation of deep learning teaches drones to survive the weather. On coronavirus, the WHO study using excess death studies has found that the pandemic killed 15 million people in the first 2 years. Technology, Biden is to launch an initiative focused on 3D printing. We'll learn about what he's wanting. On energy and the environment, the scientists have discovered breaking it down in days, not centuries. In materials, there's a new 2D material, skyrmions, that advance low power computing. In space, this device hopes to answer the ultimate existential questions. Why is the universe made of matter and not antimatter? And why does it exist at all? Biology. Honeybees apparently join us, or maybe we join them, as the only known animals that can tell the difference between odd and even numbers. Interesting. Now, for us, apparently our neurons work completely differently than previously thought. The brain learns differently from what has been thought for the last 70 years. And in health, we've created a device that could allow instant disease diagnosis while fitting inside your phone lens. Soon, our phones will be a great first-line medical diagnostic tool. So that's what we'll talk about. And now, Richard, what's this in our top story, that rapid adaptation of deep learning teaches drones to survive any weather?
Now, I really had this for more reasons than drones' ability to fly in tough weather, but more to show the kind of changes that are happening because of these drones. And this is just one part of it. You know, the first thing about drones is the way they plan to use them in civilian life, like delivering packages and even rescuing injured drivers from a traffic accident. The drones have to be able to adapt to different wind conditions. And it's enough of a problem where a team of engineers at Caltech have developed a new system. They call it Neural Fly, and it's a deep learning method that helps drones cope with new and unexpected weather conditions in real time. And the trick that they've figured out is how to do it from just updating a few key parameters. Because the problem with these AI systems is they have an enormous amount of data that they deal with, and it's hard to deal with an enormous amount of data in real time. Anyway, so this was created at Caltech, and they have a special wind tunnel there, which is a 10 by 10 uh, space that has more than 1,200 tiny computer operated fans let them create any wind condition from a light gust to a gale. And so they needed to do this because it turns out uh, flying and the variable conditions in flying is a real complicated problem, and it's only partially understood by the physics and dynamics, and it can't be easily characterized in some kind of single mathematical model. So they basically had to put their drone in this test condition where they could subject it to a lot of different winds and have it learn how to adapt to these wind conditions and be able to control itself. And they to deal with the problem with all the data, they really have separated it into two problems. One is a deep learning problem, and another is adaptive control. And deep learning is kind of what's going on in the background, and the adaptive control is what controls it now. And what they were able to do in their testing of this drone in their wind tunnel is one of the test problems they have is they have it navigate a figure eight and then subject it to all kinds of crazy changing wind conditions. And it turns out this their drone approach is 3 or 4 times better than any other AI driven drone flying approach. And they have it refined enough where these drones can have their adaptive AI flying wind control system, and it's implemented on a $20 Raspberry Pi. So it's implemented on a real tiny light computer, and uh, they're able to control drones in more situations. Part of what they haven't talked about in this article, but is also part of what's happening with drones, is the using network swarm drones where you have a bunch of drones flying that are connected together and getting the sensor data from all the drones, and these together are much more effective than individual drones. And we know that the current use of drone technology is a thing that is enabled Ukraine to basically be able to fight on a par with what's supposed to be the very superior Russian forces, and the more primitively armed Ukrainians using these drone technologies and anti-tank munitions have been able to do remarkably well. And this is just the beginning of the use of this kind of AI drone technology.
Any thoughts?
Well, I read somewhere, I believe that they now also have these drones. They can literally fly through a forest in swarms.
Yes, yes,
That is totally amazing. You know, if you use it in wartime, you approach an enemy who thinks they can hide in between the trees, and but there's no place to hide.
no place to hide. Yes. Don't tell that to the Russians.
Well, I think they have already found out. Hard
Okay.
way. Yeah.
Yes.
Our coronavirus story from the WHO says that the pandemic killed 15 million people in the first 2 years. Any thoughts?
Worldwide.
And that is compared to an official death count of 5.4 million. So they're saying the actual deaths around the world, the excess deaths in these last 2 years have been 15 million people. It's actually uh, the most severe is in India. India reported about 500,000 deaths, and the WHO estimates that almost 5 million people died in India. So there, the actual rate looks like it's 10 times higher than the reported rate. And using this excess death calculation, that captured not only the reported COVID 19 deaths, but also unreported COVID 19 deaths, and then deaths that are indirectly caused, for example, when people can't get treatment at hospitals because the hospitals are overflowing or overflowing. Now, in the US, in this 2 year period, there were reported about 900,000 deaths, and they say the actuals were closer to 1.1 million. That's not nearly as far off as it was in India. But to put this into some kind of scale, Andrew was talking last week, kind of wondering a little bit why people are as concerned as they are because we have the flu, and the flu is around and causes lots of problems. In the US, typical death rates of flu run between 30 and 60,000 a year, and that's 1/10 of the rate of the COVID death rate. So I think one of the reasons that COVID concerns people is that, like in the US, it looks like it's killing 10 times as many people.
Any thoughts?
Well, I think that after India, that Africa, I believe, also had a very high number. And it seems to me that when a virus like COVID hits, we should make all efforts to distribute vaccines worldwide, simultaneously almost.
Isn't it true that India produced a lot of the vaccines? Why aren't these vaccines available for their own population?
India, I think, is a little bit behind the curve, and they uh, have not developed and released any vaccines that I've heard about that are substantial. They're producing ones that are made by other people. I think that they were licensed for the Chinese vaccines, but I'm not sure where they were licensed. Anyway, it's a good question. It just has taken India time to get their vaccine industry rolling for COVID.
And all this stuff about preventing death is really wrong. All they're doing is postponing death. Everybody's going to die, so
Well, okay. Uh, that means after they're born, we should just go ahead and put them in the cremation thing and avoid all this problem in between.
no, that's not that at all.
Ah, okay.
But the media spin everything to attract our attention and influence our opinions, and this is just more example of it.
Uh-huh. Except if it was, your kid that died, you might respond not quite so dispassionately.
Well, and that's true, but when they report these numbers, they don't provide all the information. Like what fraction were people that were in their 80s or 90s and at the end of their lives anyway? I
Anyway,
think,
you see a lot of those numbers if you look for it, and one of the things that has concerned people is there's been a high enough fraction of people in the young part of their life and not just oldies like us. If it was just oldies like us, I don't think it would be as much of a fuss, because who cares about a bunch of gray hairs?
well, that's
Now,
true. But the other
some,
thing, well, the
some
other
people
real
brought up,
question here, the other real question here is, uh, people don't seem to even act in their own self-interest to take responsibility. We've got these ongoing problems with smoking and obesity and narcotics and all sorts of stuff. And nobody does anything about that.
Well, some people don't act. In the case of the vaccines, it looks like more than two-thirds of the people have taken action to protect themselves and the people around them. So you're saying nobody does it is overstatement.
No,
Also smoking has been going down and reducing in numbers for the last 50 years. So something is happening.
well, as the smoking goes down, the obesity and diabetes and all this stuff go up. So I don't know, something's got to kill us, I guess.
So
but
what did you eat this morning, Andrew?
the big, we can't hear you, Norman.
We can see you though. You look like you're muted. It looks like your audio is muted, Norman. And there's an icon on mine. It's in the lower left of the screen and it looks like a microphone. And you click on there, it says connecting to audio. Something's happening over there in Norman land.
There he is.
I believe we can hear you. Speak to us, Norman.
No, it's too much.
Okay. I can tell from what we see on his screen, he's looking at his screen, trying to figure out where is that control. I think he might be on a new computer too.
Well, it has a different name.
That's right. That's why I think that. And I don't see any sign of a microphone, so it looks like he may not have the microphone enabled for Zoom or something like that. So it's going to be perhaps something like that. Sorry, Norman. I don't even see your microphone icon crossed off. So it means I have no audio from you at all. Anyway, I think it says it's connecting to audio,
Yeah, dancing dots.
but I still don't see the microphone icon on my participant control screen. So I think we should continue and Norman will take care of himself if he can.
If we are continuing, what's this new initiative that Biden will launch focused on 3D printing?
Now, I think this is actually a real clever thing for him to do. He is saying he's going to launch a new initiative aimed at lowering costs for American families by focusing on 3D printing. And the thing uh, about 3D printing is that it fits in the current supply chain problem era. And the reason it fits is that if you print it in your 3D printer, you don't have to ship it anywhere. So it makes for a very much more efficient process. And So Biden is starting off working with several big companies, GE Aviation, Honeywell, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and Siemens Energy as initial participants. It's entirely a voluntary effort, and uh, they're saying not enough American companies are using 3D printing or other high performance production technologies, and that companies want to make the investment, but often they don't have enough committed orders and cash flow to be able to make the investment. The article says typically it's a range from $3 to $8 million to convert your manufacturing process where it can use 3D printing. And companies don't have the orders for 3D printed products, of course, because they can't make them yet because they don't have the right equipment. So it's a little bit of a chicken and the egg problem. And what Biden is trying to do is he's trying to help the process along. And so he plans to launch federal programs to help small and mid-sized manufacturers to adopt 3D printing, and is going to help them get access to capital, technical assistance, and workforce training. And the overall goal is to reduce costs for Americans by making more things in American, and where you can invent more and make more and bring middle class jobs. And I personally think that it is brilliant. This is one of the transitions that we're going through, and pushing to uh, adopt on a wide scale this additive manufacturing, I think will end up being seen as a kind of pivotal moment for manufacturing in America.
Any thoughts?
Well, I wonder what kind of products they are looking at. Are they looking at construction projects? Or are they looking at small things like parts of some sort?
A big part of it is components.
Right. Well, but still, a
And
component in the construction.
Well,
Uh,
components in manufacturing, you can make metal things, you can make things like metal gears and mechanical components out of 3D printing instead of the way they're fabricated now, which is a lot of it is expensive molded or machined metal parts. Certainly, you can do it with complex plastic parts. You can also 3D print things that include within it a circuit board and wiring and things like this that make for an more integrated package that uses fewer parts. So there's all kind of stuff you can do with it besides 3D printing houses.
Not
yeah.
only that, but the savings in transportation has to be phenomenal.
Yes, no shit. Again, I
Yeah.
spent a part of my life as a manufacturing production planner, so I'm real aware of how this stuff works in the factory, and you have some place that does make some thing, and you want to make sure there are enough parts in front of them where they don't become idle and lose productivity. So it means you spread all this inventory around within your system, and when you get it from Chicago and you're in LA, then there's trucks in between you and warehouses and all this other stuff. And what about, instead of all of that, if the thing right by the assembly station just printed the parts when you need them? It makes everything a lot easier.
Absolutely.
It's a little bit simplistic though to imagine that 3D printing is going to solve all these problems, because 3D printing really lends itself to small production runs and has a much higher labor much higher labor component of the article than these massive volume production runs. And this, we never heard about supply chain problems before globalization became the big thing. And globalization was really marketers chasing low labor costs by moving production into Asia and the third world. And I just don't think 3D printing is going to solve that problem. What we have to do is somehow get people to be willing to pay more for goods that are locally produced.
Now, the other place, again, in my time as a production planner, one of the things that I did was I was material manager for a consumer products operation that did the bulk of their manufacturing in Asia, and the bulk of their sales were in the US. And that supply line that we had there meant that we had at that time at least weeks worth of sales inventory in ships at any time. If we needed some in a hurry, we could air freight it, but it was more expensive. And the cost, there's a financial cost that is pretty heavy that is involved in the way that we operate. And all of those ships going across the street or across the sea have big piles of inventory in them. And what I learned in doing this kind of production control work is what we think of as inventory, the accountants see as piles of money. So we have all of these ships with big piles of money in them. And that doesn't always help.
But in your own experience, would 3D printing have made a difference?
Oh, it certainly could have. If, for example, with a calculator, instead of making a calculator out of a molded plastic casing with another thing for the key set, another component for the printed circuit board, and all the components, if that thing was two pieces and you stuff the chip in it, instead of being 80 pieces, it would have been a lot easier. It depends, of course, upon the cost of the 3D printing and the production rate. Because you need to have the process be fast enough to support your manufacturing processes. So one of the reasons I'm excited about it is the time I spent as a manufacturing guy, and so it's just I have an instinctive appeal to things that make the process simpler and faster.
Well, it would be interesting if somebody looked at the range of stuff that Walmart sells and determined what fraction of it could be 3D
Mm-hmm.
printed.
Mm-hmm.
And it'd be interesting to know what fraction of the total US kind of consumption could be 3D printed, because that it's low enough volume that it would make sense to 3D print it as opposed to
Mm-hmm.
these high volume things. But
Well, again, when you look at it, there's a cost trade-off between manufacturing cost and shipping cost and all of those other details, and you just have to look at that carefully. And I know these manufacturing companies that I worked with looked at it down certainly at the 10th of a cent level, so they look pretty closely.
yeah,
Anyway.
We've heard lots of stories about the problems with plastic. So much of it and what it's going to do. And we really need to break it down. And apparently, there now is a method not of breaking it down for centuries, but of breaking it down in just a matter of days. Tell us about that.
Okay, in the US, I think one of the, or in the world, I think one of the great consumer hustles that was done by the bottle companies who, with plastic bottles, made us see recycling as our problem instead of the way that they had collected and dealt with the bottles in the glass bottle days. And they spent a lot of money on promoting organizations that promote recycling. And in the US, after all of the efforts towards recycling since the days of Lady Bird Johnson, uh, right now, the estimates that I read recently said 5% of the plastic in the US is recycled. 5%. And uh, so they've been working on how to do this, and one of the things I think is promising is now scientists at the University of Texas at Austin, uh, they have discovered in the last 20 years 19 different bacteria that make enzymes that digest PET plastics. And that's the kind of plastic that's in the plastic bottles. And what the scientists did is they took the best performing one and did genetic analysis and uh, then used CRISPR genes changing techniques to modify then the bacteria. And they have created a fast acting protein that breaks down PET in a matter of days instead of centuries. So that's a lot faster. And not only does it break it down, the good part about it, I think, is that it breaks it down and a catalyst can separate out the monomers of which the polymer is made, and then these monomers can be recombined and to make a new polymer. And that cannot be done with recycling. Why? In recycling, the typical way they recycle is to melt it and reuse it. That means you have a problem with dyes and things like this because they don't go through that process. They contaminate it. And then also, each time you melt it and reuse it, it's not as strong, so it has a much more limited use. And this process, which takes the polymer and breaks it down into a monomer, when you recombine the monomer, you're basically making a new plastic, and you're making this new plastic without additional petroleum. So this is, I think, they're working to make sure it scales up. They think it will scale up well, and they believe if they're able to succeed in this, that we'll move into an era where it will take at least one kind of plastic, a kind of plastic that is used very widely throughout the world, and make it where you can actually truly recycle it through the work of specially engineered bacteria.
Any thoughts?
Well, one of the unintended consequences will be that these bacteria will evolve and infect our airplanes and be eating the plastic insulation off the wiring in the airplane. So
Could
who
be,
knows what could happen? The other
could
thing
be,
that
or they could design them so they still require something in their environment that does to survive that does not exist in airplanes, and then we made our airplane protector.
Yeah.
I think if we are able to identify issues like this the first time we've heard about this kind of development, I think it's possible that the guys who have devoted their life to it might also have thought of them too.
Well, and another thing that's interesting is for recycling, about 45% of the aluminum beer cans and pop cans are recycled as opposed to the 5% of plastic water bottles.
And
So you
opposed to
wonder
the
if,
98% of the glass bottles prior to the plastic.
yeah, like I think the rate for glass recycling now is about 30% or so.
Right,
It's not as much as aluminum cans,
right.
but they could be like people buying water in these plastic bottles are stupid anyway, but they could be selling it in aluminum cans to increase the recycle rate if they really want
Okay,
to.
I can see the ad now. Andrew thinks you're stupid. Buy it in a can.
Yeah,
I found it interesting, and perhaps this is something for another day, but the amount of artificial intelligence that is being used in research because it's so complicated that you need algorithms to do your
Hmm.
research for you, and
Hmm.
and they use that here because of how complicated it was.
Well, yes, that's one of the things they use AI to figure out uh, the ways to tweak the bacteria to make the enzyme better. They're also using AI in plastic recycling connected to camera lenses that have been developed to help them sort plastic. So they have plastic sorters that are AI driven robots watching the moving plastic on the belt and separating it into PET and these other things.
My point here is that they're programming AI to do the research.
Right, I know. Well, this is one of the reasons, this is things that get us close to the famous singularity when the computers are smarter than we are.
Right.
Because when the computers can figure it out without us, what do they need us for?
I read a lot of science fiction books, and there's many themes like that.
That's right. That's right. More 40 or 50 years ago than now, perhaps, but because now
Mhm.
they have other disasters to worry about.
But
Self-programming robots.
Yes.
Think about it.
but the recycling of glass bottles was like almost 98%, I believe I read.
Yes.
And so uh, what we could do with plastic is to make manufacturers add a premium to it. If something is bought in plastic, that when you return it, you would get a
Hmm.
credit of some sort. But of course, competition makes this very difficult. But if government were to demand that, we might get a much better return on plastic.
Uh-huh. I think you're right, John, but I think that horse escaped from the barn already.
I realize that, but that's where governments come in. I mean, if they
Well,
demand it,
well, that's why we have these big corporations to convince the governors to pass
yeah,
the
do not do it.
responsibility from the corporations to the people. It's another case of, capitalizing the profits and socializing the costs.
Well, another vote for Biden would help.
Richard, what's this new 2D material, skirmion, that advanced low power computing?
Well, the skirmions are not necessarily 2D, but they're something that occurs in 2D materials. Skirmions are more or less like a whirlpool of electrons. And uh, it turns out two-dimensional magnetic materials are one of the kind of building blocks of the next generation of technology. And one of the reasons why they believe this is the case is that uh, you can make these materials of layers of crystalline sheets, just a few atoms thick, and by tweaking the chemistry of these crystalline sheets, you can uh, create and change unique magnetic properties that end up getting the electrons to spin very nicely and form these skyrmions. And these skyrmions are low energy to create, and they figured out how to be able to affect them with electrical impulses outside that sheet of material. So if you have something that's low energy and you can change its state also with low energy, that something you can control to change its state is at the basis of all of our computing, where we have digital things with ones or zeros. That's two different states. The thing that's cool about quantum computing is you can change it to three different states. Anyway, so with fermions, you can affect them and read them and change them, so they are a way to be able to store and manipulate data, basically, at remarkably low levels of energy. And here, what the approach these guys used is they used what's a semiconductor manufacturing technique, which is doping, adding defined levels of impurities in a substance that they make into a crystal that becomes one of the layers of the layered 2D material. And by fiddling with the elements within the crystals, they can change its electronic properties. And here they figured out using cobalt doped iron germanium telluride, uh, which is a thing there, 2D magnetic material that there's a lot of research going on now. And by using this doping technique and replacing half of the iron atoms with cobalt atoms, they spontaneously break the material's natural crystal symmetry, which in turn uh, altered the spin structure and turned it into a bunch of skyrmions. And so this is a pure science discovery. It was not something they expected to do. And what they found is that they can manipulate the electronic structure, and by breaking the symmetry, the material could host skyrmions, and skyrmions are like I talked about before, of immense interest for, I think, not the next generation technology, the generation after the next generation. So, this skyrmions are, since they are based on electrons, electrons are smaller than atoms, and so it's getting down to be where it's pretty tiny.
Any thoughts?
Come on, guys. Somebody must have some thoughts about these electron tornadoes.
It was beyond me.
Yeah,
I know,
beyond
me
me
too. Me too. One of the things that is my challenge and pleasure in doing this is some of these articles that I report on are way beyond anything I understand. So I got to stretch every week.
Well, Richard, maybe people wanted to get off that onto the really ultimate questions, like why is the universe made of matter, not antimatter? Why does it exist at all? And what's this device that hopes to answer this?
Well, again, it's more technology, and this is a 41 million pixel detector that it was assembled at the University of London with components from different people, and then was installed in the LHC, the Linear Hadron whatever it is. I can't remember what LHC remembers. Can anybody in our audience?
I think it's some sort of collider.
Right, it is. It
Yeah.
absolutely, it's a big European collider. And anyway, so with this snazzy 41 million pixel detector, uh, they hope to be able to answer just a few questions that some people care about. And one of them is, why is the universe made out of matter? Why isn't it made out of antimatter? And also, why does the universe exist at all? And uh, the reason that they ask these kind of questions is because of our understanding of the Big Bang, which is really defines the understanding of physics at this time. And the way we understand the Big Bang is that the beginning of the universe, we had this fine balance between matter and antimatter. And we think that when the universe began, there were equal amounts of matter and antimatter. And what should have happened is that it all should have just annihilated each other and turned into energy. But there was some stuff left over. And that stuff that's left over from all these collisions is the universe that we know today. And again, to our best understanding, matter and antimatter were created in equal quantity, and it didn't end up in equal quantity because we have a universe that's filled with matter and we don't have any antimatter hardly anywhere. And what happened to make this work out this way? And that's what they're trying to figure out. They see a little bit of evidence that in some of these uh, atomic trans changes where one atom or one particle changes from one particle into another particle, they have found small amounts of what is called change parity violation. That's when it's not equal, when it changes from one way to another way and then back. It doesn't come balance the books perfectly. And that broken symmetry, they suspect, is the reason why there's more matter than antimatter. Maybe in one way, moving, say, from matter to antimatter, it's not the same as when you move from antimatter to matter. And that broken symmetry, to be able to detect it, you really have to look at very uh, small and fast details. What they were able to see before with the last generations of these detectors, they were able to look within these collisions in the LHC and identify a couple of kind of subatomic particles that where there are subtle differences. These are beauty quarks and charm quarks. And these exotic quark containing particles uh, known as B and D mesons are produced during collisions within the Large Hadron Collider. That's the LHC. And they're really difficult to study because they decay fast. And by fast, I mean fast in a millionth of a second. So that doesn't give you very much time to study them. Thus, the need for this better detector to be able to study them in more detail. And they'll have this detector right next to the proximity of where the collision is, so it's close and very fast. And what they hope to be able to do is to study the actual results of these quarks and the decay of these quarks and uh, take careful measurements of the particles as they decay, and by comparing these readings to predictions made by the standard model, they will look for deviations and from the standard model. And deviations from the standard model means the standard model doesn't work. And so they believe that this kind of study could open up the next generation of the understanding of physics, and maybe we'll have an answer for why the universe began to begin with.
Any thoughts?
Well, what's really amazing is just that they can detect something that happens in a millionth of a second.
Yes, no shit. Yes.
Yeah. Well, Richard, if we were to move on, how do we know that honeybees can tell the difference between odd and even numbers?
Well, that's a good question. They knew to start with, you know, as children, we learned to tell the difference between odd and even numbers, and maybe we do it in two different ways. The way I learned is by mathematics. If you divide it by 2 and get whole numbers, then it's even. And if you divide it by 2 and don't get a whole number, then it's odd. Uh, the other way that you tell the difference is by pairing things. And when you pair things, if there's none left over, it's even. And if there's something left over, it's odd. So they had not been able to find the ability to understand the difference between odd and even in the animal kingdom. And by studying honeybees, they determined that honeybees can tell the difference. So what's the big deal, you know? Children, it turns out, when they start to associate even, they naturally associate even as right and odd is left, which I think is an odd kind of association. And it looks like it's not cultural, it's something deeper within our brain. And so humans have some kind of bias. It seems like they're not sure whether it's environmental or in terms of our brain structure. But now, as they study these honeybees, they see the honeybees can replicate the human understanding of odd and even. What they did is they took honeybees and trained them uh, to associate, in one case, even numbers with sugar water and odd numbers with bitter tasted liquid, and were able to use uh, their reaction, that is, being attracted versus being repelled, to see if they were able to determine whether what they were looking at was odd or even. And the honeybees, after some training, are very good at this. They did the training the other way around, and they found that when bees were trained to associate odd numbers with the sweet sugar water, they learned quicker than they learned associating odd numbers with a bitter taste. And so from this, they believe that the honeybees have a different mental bias than humans do, because the humans' preference, it looks like it's odd numbers for right, and the honeybees have a preference for, or excuse me, the honeybees have a preference for odd numbers, and the humans like even numbers better. And I don't know why that is. Maybe we have 10 fingers. I don't know how many fingers honeybees have. I don't think they have any. But one thing that they find that's interesting about this is the humans do it with our brain that has uh, typically 86 billion neurons, and the bees do it with a brain of about 960,000 neurons. So the bees are able to solve the problem of odd or even with a brain that is about 1/1 millionth the size of the humans.
Any,
So,
I would need to read the study it a little closer, but I just get this feeling that it's somewhat superficial, because there's just so many other factors involved. I mean, a bee's maybe just sees shapes, and the bee's eye is much different than our eye. And there's so many other things involved that I just have a feeling that they're reading more into this study than they should.
well, I think they were, in terms of odd or even, they were using the same thing, just different numbers of them.
Maybe the bee recognizes the symbol, though, not the number.
But
That symbol
anyway,
is good.
but
That
here
one is
he
bad.
sees the symbols. To me, when I was thinking about this, one of the things that I was wondering about is, I wonder if this ability to discriminate odd or even is somehow related to the abilities, the bee's ability, directional ability, where they're able to go back and find something, and to find something, they go some direction and get somewhere and turn left or right, and that's kind of like odd or even. And I just wonder if that something like that is where it comes from.
what kind of numbers are we talking about? Is it the difference between 3 and 4, or a thousand,
It's right. The numbers are smaller because they don't ask the bee to count a googolplex versus a googolplex -1. So the numbers that they talked about, I believe, were single digit numbers, but not just 2 and 3. That would include 8 and 9. They talked about in the articles numbers up to about a dozen. And
Did you know?
they said, by the way, that after they had been trained on single digit numbers, they were able to, without additional training, working with 11 or 12 elements as odd or even, and without training, they were able to distinguish it about 70%.
So what is the significance of this?
Well, I don't
Pure-
know.
It's pure research.
And
It's pure research. It also shows that human beings that think we're such big shit, we ain't so big shit after all. Even bees can do it.
I remember, sitting there, being very busy, staring at a little twig, and there's a bee on there, and it would lift his one leg, and then another one, and then a third one maybe, and then back to the first one. So maybe they're mathematically gifted.
Okay, he's counting on his legs instead of
Yeah, right.
fingers. Okay.
Well, and did you know that they've proven that horses have an odd number of legs?
Really?
It can be mathematically proven. And it goes that we all know that they have 2 legs on the back and they have 4 legs on the front for a total of 6 legs. But that's an odd number of legs for a horse.
Per
So that-
side, but I think I'm not sure what you're smoking in Canada, but it's better than what we have in Mexico.
Anyway, horses have an odd number of legs.
I did in India. I saw a cow with 5 legs. One of them was growing out of its back.
How did they do that, you wonder?
I think it was just an odd one. It didn't look like it was grafted on.
But it wasn't using it for anything.
No, it was using it as a fundraising device.
It was a spare leg.
That's right. Come and donate your rupees to this special sacred freak cow.
Yeah.
And since it was a cow, India couldn't eat it, kill it, and eat it. So they turned it into a moneymaker.
Richard, I've been trying to discover what you people are talking about. And apparently, my brain has learned differently about that. What is this about neurons working differently than we previously thought?
Well, for the last 70 years, what we have thought is the way neurons work is that learning shows up by modifying the strength of the synapse. And the synapse is where the connection happens between 2 different brain cells. And so that's what we thought of it. And as we have tried to emulate the brain with computers, then that fits the way we think about computers because that's kind of on and off. And it turns out that is not how the brain learns. That shows learning as something that happens between 2 cells as the 2 cells interact. And what researchers at the Burhan University in Israel discovered is the brain learns completely differently than what's been assumed. And new experimental observation suggests that learning is mainly performed in neuronal dendritic trees. And these neuronal dendritic trees are structures that come out from the individual neuron and are part of that neuron's structure, and that it looks like the way the learning happens is that the trunk and the branches of the tree, as they learn, they modify their strength. And the reason why the cell will signal in its synapse differently is because of the learning that it has accumulated within these dendritic trees. So the neuron is actually a lot more complex, dynamic, and computational element than we had thought of before. And just one single neuron can realize what the computer guys talk about now as deep learning. And then we have millions of these neurons in our brains. And so these findings pave the way for a more efficient, biologically inspired new kind of AI hardware and algorithm. And it's going to end up being a different world. And they talk about this in one of the ways where I've thought about it. A brain's clock is 1 billion times slower than existing parallel graphic processing units. But the brain has a comparable success rate in many perceptual paths. As you look at me now and I wave my hands around, it all looks to you like this is in real time, and you're handling a lot of data to get that real time image. But your brain is 1 billion times slower than the best of the computers. And so this new demonstration of learning on dendritic trees calls for new approaches in brain research as well as a new generation of computer hardware. And if we can implement this kind of stuff within the computers, imagine what these slow brain dynamics can do on an ultra fast computer. Wow.
Well,
Any thoughts?
I wonder if it is always when we're faced with a problem, do we engage, we have no choice in that, of course, do we engage one neuron or is it a combination or does the brain,
Where most of them, it's a combination. And when they talk about how the brain works, now they talk about not individual cells or even individual areas of the brain, but they're talking about different parts of the brain network together to deal with what it's dealing with. So that's not an individual cell, but these different networks are made out of individual cells that turn out to have a lot more capability than just on off.
but what causes this combination to take place? It depends on the problem for one,
Right.
but there must be other brain cells that sort of regulate that then.
Now, the other thing the brain does that just fascinates me is as you use it, then as when you have your next good sleep, then the brain starts to rewire itself and make the parts of it that you use that day stronger. So the brain has a mechanism where it updates its own software every night.
Well, and does this mean that the brain isn't digital as much as something else?
Right, I think it does.
So maybe our brains are analog as opposed to digital.
Or something, or, certainly our brains are not binary. And right now, we know as with an engineering background like both of us have, it's easy to understand digital versus analog, but this might be something in between them.
Well, the other interesting thing is really we don't see anything in real time because what our brains
Sure,
do
of
is
course.
take all these sensory inputs and create this image or this kind of
Right,
artificial reality to explain our environment to
right,
us.
right. And what we are aware of is that artificial environment projected by the brain within inside our mind. And as I talk to people in meditation, I say, if you're thinking about it, you can never get to now. But anyway, and I won't say the rest of it. So we'll just go on. Save that for another time. I experience now directly, though.
Well, I was hoping we talked maybe about imagination, where that comes.
Well, how do you? It's hard to differentiate imagination from our everyday experience because all of it is just fabricated inside this brain. And so it's hard to tell the difference sometimes between imagination and reality.
Especially for liberals.
That's right. That's right. We have to make it all up. Otherwise, we'd just be different.
You mean Republicans, they don't have
I
enough.
don't want, I was trying to avoid saying anything negative.
All right, I'm a Democrat.
Well, the other interesting thing about these brain studies is that all these researchers look at the brain like a black box, and they really don't know the mechanical workings of what's going on inside there, but they try to interpret it on the basis of the way the black box performs different
Well,
functions.
that's one of the ways they look at it, but they look at it in more detail also. So there you'd see there are a variety of viewpoints in neuroscience, and this is an example of looking at it at the neuron level uh, is pretty close to a component level instead of the black box.
Yeah, it's a construction of a whole bunch of black boxes, but then when they look at a neuron, it itself is kind of a black
Sure,
box.
of course. Until you know, and then it's something you know, and there's something else that's the black box.
Yeah, it's kind of a Russian nested doll of black boxes.
That's right. That's right.
But we've now got a device that can solve all of that. What is this? A first line medical diagnostic tool that fits inside your phone lens? What's that?
So the, there's a problem around the world with infectious diseases like malaria, which is still a leading cause of death in many places. And part of the problem is because people don't have access to medical diagnostic tools that can detect these diseases at an early stage. And so, in medical science, the way that many of these diseases are detected is through optical microscopes looking at biological cells and seeing the difference and then detecting the disease at that level. And this is a little hard to do because a lot of the internal features in a cell are transparent. And to solve it, uh, one of the things that's done is chemical staining. And I think we all may have seen slides that are examples of that, microscopic slides that are stained so you can see what's going on. Another approach is to use a process called phase imaging, which exploits the fact that light which is passed through a cell contains information about the transparent part of the cell and makes that information visible. And conventional phase imaging methods rely on a process that has bulky components and is expensive, and so it really is not readily available. So these guys trying to deal with that, there is a whole area that is happening in optics broadly where they are looking at the use of tiny materials, nanometer thick devices that potentially have low production costs. And they have figured out here a system that can perform instantaneous phase imaging and that is only a few hundred nanometers thick and could be easily implemented as just a coating on the existing camera lens. So if you had this as a coating on the camera lens, you would able to use it in a level layer like it is a microscope, and then be able to use it to have it look at a saliva sample or a blood sample, and then be able to get the same kind of quality microscopic images that are needed to diagnose your condition. Right now, they still are, has done this in the lab, they still have to scale it up. They're talking now about you could take these images and then forward them to your doctor or a medical lab or something like that anywhere in the world and have them read and interpret it. I think that the second generation of this will be to connect these images to some kind of AI system and have them do the diagnosis as well. So these kind of developments are developments that start to turn the phone into a device of portable medical test technology.
Any thoughts?
Well, another good thing about it is once your phone knows what's wrong with you, you can expect all these pop-up ads for
That's
different
right. Buy
medicines.
this. That's right.
Yeah, so it's just getting better and better.
But
Yeah.
you have to spit it your phone first to so I can read the sample.
There's probably just enough saliva in the air when you're talking to your phone that it could pick it up and have a look at it.
Well, if it detects something very serious, like, well, I had that experience many years ago where a doctor was looking at some medical information I provided a relative of mine, and there was a lady, she said, "Oh, he's a goner." So I can just see your computer tell you that, "Hey, you're dead," or something like that.
Oh, that's right. You're going to die next week. Do you want us
Yeah,
to
right.
cancel
Yeah,
your accounts for you?
yeah, right. Exactly.
Okay.
Well, it's when the pop-up ads are for caskets and crematoriums and stuff like
Yeah,
that.
That's right. Then you would know. Okay.
yeah.
So thanks a lot, Richard, and thanks for everybody for participating. And once again, we'll see you next week. Bye for now.
Okay.
Thanks very much,
Adios.
All right.
Richard.
Thanks. Good. Oh, incidentally, I want to mention that Sue is not there because her husband passed away about 3 days ago.
Ah, okay.
Who's that?
The lady who was, talking, had a lot of opinions all the time. She's my neighbor, actually.
Ah,
She is
okay.
a doctor of veterinary medicine.
Yes, yes.
And anyway, her husband had a very aggressive bout of cancer and succumbed.
Sorry
So
to hear.
anyway, yeah. So I haven't talked to her yet, but